There is a profound, hollow silence that screams inside you when the noise of the city finally fades, and the blue light of your smartphone is the only thing left illuminating the dark. It is an inexplicable void, a dense existential ache that surfaces in those quiet moments, perhaps during a long commute on a crowded subway, or while staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering why your life feels like a high-speed chase toward a destination that doesn't exist. We were raised on the religion of the grind. We were told from birth that the pursuit of happiness was a finish line we could reach if we just worked hard enough, climbed the corporate ladder fast enough, or bought a big enough house in the suburbs. We've become masters of the hustle, smiling for the cameras and checking off boxes on a list of societal expectations. Yet behind that curated success, there is an invisible shadow whispering that something essential, something sacred, is missing. Why is it that in the wealthiest, most successful era in history, we feel like a nation of sleepwalkers lost in an invisible labyrinth of our own making? The answer to this chronic, quiet desperation doesn't lie in a new productivity app, a better stock portfolio, or the shallow promises of self-help gurus. The key to deciphering this enigma was found long ago by a man who had the courage to descend into the darkest depths of the human psyche. His name was Carl Jung. We are not here to discuss the dry, academic psychiatrist found in dusty textbooks. We are here to talk about the old sage, the alchemist of the soul, the man who walked the thin, misty border between the visible world and the unseen, and returned with a map drawn in light and shadow. Jung understood that the anxiety gnawing at your spirit isn't a glitch in your brain to be medicated away. It is a sacred calling. He saw our inner pain as the cry of a soul trying to wake up from a deep, drugged sleep. Imagine you were born inside a house with no windows, and you spent your entire life believing that the darkness of those four walls was the entire universe. Jung was the man who felt the walls, found the hidden door, swung it open, and stepped out into the blinding radiance of the sun. He realized that our spirits were not meant to stagnate in a cycle of production and consumption. We are part of a grand cosmic loom, placed here to evolve, to refine our own consciousness through a relentless spiritual journey. However, the tragic error of our modern age is the belief that growth happens on the outside. We accumulate titles, degrees, and followers, but our souls remain wandering in rags. How can we find true peace if we don't even know which level of perception we are currently imprisoned in? Ancient wisdom teaches us that the universe is made of layers, and the human mind is the perfect mirror of that vastness. Jung observed the forgotten myths of the world and the dreams whispered by humanity throughout time, and he discovered a silent, universal pattern. He saw that the journey to absolute peace, the total integration of the self where suffering finally ceases, requires us to pass through four portals, four veils of illusion that cover our eyes and distort reality. Each veil represents a stage of development, a trial by fire that the soul must face to liberate itself from its own cage. But the uncomfortable truth, the one most people refuse to accept while they race against the clock for money or status, is that the vast majority of us are born, live, and die trapped behind the very first or second veil. We spend decades spinning in the same rusted gears, repeating the same mistakes, dating the same toxic people, and mourning the same losses, never realizing that the bars of our prison are forged by our own unexamined thoughts and blind desires. Have you ever wondered why the same type of suffering keeps showing up at your door, just wearing a different suit or a different name? Jung's answer to these repetitions is as sharp as a blade. Whatever you do not resolve within your own spirit, the world will eventually transform into your fate. As long as you don't have the courage to understand which veil your existence is tangled in right now, you will continue to be a dry leaf blown by the violent, unpredictable winds of circumstance. The map this old sage left behind isn't a path of comfort. It is a journey of extreme honesty. It requires you to look into the mirror of your own life with brutal clarity and ask yourself where your soul decided to stop walking. To reach true wisdom, the state where opposites finally unite and the chaos of the world no longer disturbs the silence of your heart, you must first have the humility to recognize the weight of the chains holding you down. It is a dangerous illusion, born of spiritual vanity, to think we can fly toward the light without first knowing the rough, cold texture of our own inner darkness. The true sage is not the one who ignores the material world, but the one who understands it so deeply that they finally stop being its slave. Jung invites us to close our physical eyes and open the eyes of the spirit. He teaches us that true peace isn't the magical absence of storms, but the construction of an unbreakable fortress within yourself. Think about your own life. How many times have you tried to change your reality by changing your scenery? You moved to a new city, got a new job, or started a new relationship, only to find that the same heavy emptiness traveled in the suitcase right along with you. The stage changes, the actors are replaced, but the script of your life remains the same. This happens because your consciousness hasn't moved. Life is a severe but just teacher. If you don't learn the hidden lesson of a stage, life will not let you move on. It forces you to retake the test, bringing the same old challenges wrapped in new disguises. This is the great wheel of human suffering that consumes entire generations. How do we break this invisible cycle? How do we take the definitive leap from a life of reaction to a life of awakening? The first step is to stop looking for answers in the stars or in the next promotion and start looking at the ground where your tired feet are planted right now. The light of wisdom doesn't start at the sun-drenched peak of the mountain. It starts in the mud, in the heavy, cold density of our daily survival. We are spiritual beings having a dense experience, and the mystery of existence is learning to harmonize eternal light with temporary matter. The alchemical path drawn by Jung requires you to descend into your own basement before you try to touch the sky. It demands the courage to face your flaws and recognize that everything you hate in the world, out there, exists, in some measure, asleep inside you. This radical acceptance is what triggers true transformation. This journey is not a peaceful stroll. It is a call to the most solitary and important battle in the universe, the conquest of your own soul. To understand how to reach that peak of integration, we must start at the very beginning. We must investigate the primary prison where most of humanity sleeps a dreamless sleep, a state of consciousness so dense and automatic that the soul forgets its divine origin and believes it is only a body struggling to survive in a cold world. To find the exit, you must unmask the first veil, the heaviest raiment of our evolutionary journey, the portal of the earth, the shadow-filled, purely instinctive Valley of Eve. Imagine the dawn breaking over the sprawling suburbs and the steel-cold skylines of our modern cities, where the first light of morning doesn't bring a sense of wonder, but the jarring sound of an alarm clock signaling another day in the race. You rise in the dark, pouring coffee into a travel mug, enjoying the river of taillights on the interstate, or the silent, swaying crowd on the subway. This is the heavy machinery of the material world, demanding its daily tribute. Carl Jung, with his gaze that pierced through the surface of human behavior, called this first and densest stage of existence the Veil of Eve. In the language of the soul, it is the purely instinctive and biological realm where the spirit wears its most primitive clothing. In our modern reality, a culture obsessed with the grind and the bottom line, this is the stage of absolute survival. It is life reduced to the anxious mathematics of making the mortgage payment, keeping the health insurance active, and ensuring the 401k is growing. In this initial portal, the divine and creative consciousness that lives within every one of us is deeply anesthetized, silenced by the deafening noise of urgent biological needs and the inherited fear that if we stop moving for even a second, we will lose everything. Life, under the dominion of this heavy, sleeping earth, is not guided by the search for a higher purpose or the contemplation of the beauty of the universe. It is dictated by the relentless demands of the body and the constant fear of scarcity. Here, the human being is moved almost exclusively by the gears of self-preservation. There is no mental space or physical energy to think about spiritual evolution when your focus is simply not to be crushed by the weight of the system and the harsh demands of the economy. The world, seen through the thick and blurred lenses of this first veil, is a hostile, gray, and extremely dangerous environment. It is a concrete jungle where we have been trained to trust no one, to hide our true emotions behind a professional mask, and to defend our small, private territory at all costs. The relationships that are born and maintained at this level of consciousness are rarely genuine encounters of two souls overflowing with love. They are, for the most part, silent contracts of pure convenience and mutual protection. People unite not because they cannot live without the spiritual radiance of the other, but because of the pragmatic illusion that together they can face the harshness of reality and the coldness of loneliness with a little less pain. It is the cold logic of nature, operating in the heart of someone who is exhausted. You help me pay the bills. I help you keep the house in order. You offer me the security of a stable life, and I offer my loyalty in return. It is an entirely reactive and defensive life, where the individual rarely acts as the passionate author of their own story, limiting themselves to reacting with quiet resignation to the successive blows of fate, trying to keep the physical body functioning for just one more day. The great, dangerous, and seductive mystery of this first stage is that, as brutal and restrictive as it may seem to someone looking in from the outside, it is strangely cozy to those trapped inside it. Much like the interior of a climate-controlled office or a predictable suburban home, life focused only on basic survival offers a routine that is safe and a numbness that acts as a spiritual anesthesia. We get used to the ache and romanticize our own sacrifice as the way it is. The worker punches the clock, swallows the insults of the day, returns home through hours of traffic, consumes hollow entertainment on a screen to turn off the mind, falls into a heavy sleep, and repeats the exact same cycle the next morning without ever asking a dangerous question that might destabilize the security they have built. The predictability of the routine becomes the consolation prize life hands out, so that the individual doesn't lose their mind in the face of the vastness of the world. Jung observed this primary human condition with a deep and reverent compassion. He understood perfectly that the soul, when it is terrified by the unknown and traumatized by the collective memory of lack and instability, prefers 1,000 times the guaranteed safety of a prison it knows by heart to the terrifying freedom of an open and unexplored ocean. However, living your days, your years, and your vital strength just to avoid perishing is the greatest insult you can commit against the divine spark burning in your chest. That same deep passion that inspired the great poets and thinkers of the past to question the essence of the human spirit. It is the tragedy of a majestic hawk that, having been born and raised in a narrow cage, comes to genuinely believe that the act of flying is a fatal madness that must be avoided at all costs. But the hidden laws of the evolution of consciousness are relentless, and nature does not allow vital energy to remain paralyzed and frozen forever under the weight of absolute resignation. There comes a day, inescapably, when something mysterious and frightening happens in the depths of your being. It might be in the middle of a mundane afternoon in a gray cubicle, or during a lonely night when the hum of the refrigerator becomes suddenly deafening and accusatory. Suddenly, the paycheck and the security of a monotonous job are no longer enough to satisfy the invisible hunger gnawing at your soul. The safe roof that once protected you from the storms begins to feel like the lid of a stone sarcophagus being slowly closed over your head. The absolute boredom of the survival routine transforms into a silent and incredibly violent desperation that demands to be heard immediately. You look at your own hands, tired from the daily race, analyze the precious years that have already slipped through your fingers like sand, and you are hit by the terrifying realization that you have spent all your intelligence, your resilience, and your time just keeping a biological organism breathing without ever discovering the real and grand reason why life was given to you. The soul, which holds an infinite capacity for passion and intensity, suffocated under tons of gray obligations, begins to struggle with fury against the bars of its own forced stoicism. It demands fresh air, it demands movement, dizzying expansion, color, and breathtaking beauty. It flatly refuses to continue sleeping the heavy sleep of the resigned and the obedient. And it is in this exact moment of unbearable anguish, in this point of maximum tension, where the reactive and cautious life loses its sense of safety, that the human being commits their first and most powerful act of spiritual rebellion against the very fate that was imposed upon them. The paralyzing fear of scarcity, which once dictated all the rules of economy and imposed a constant modesty, is suddenly and violently devoured by an uncontrollable thirst for absolute power, for conspicuous material wealth, for unrestrained pleasure, and for social recognition on a grand scale. The individual refuses, with all the strength of their being and with a fury accumulated over a lifetime of just getting by, to continue being just another forgotten, common, and invisible shadow in the silent crowd. They want to feel the blood boil in their veins with maximum intensity. They want to shine blindingly. They want the gold. They want the luxury they always saw from a distance. They want to dominate the scene and be feared and respected. They decide, in a burst of vanity, that they will devour the material world before the world devours them and reduces them to a mere statistic. The old sage smiles at this volcanic explosion of consciousness, for he knows exactly what has just happened in the architecture of the mind. The seed has broken through the hard ground with an implacable force. The peaceful and suffering innocence of Eve has been cast aside, and the uncontrollable and ambitious fire of the ego has been lit on the altar of the heart. The soul has awakened from its long sleep of survival, only to kick open the door and run into the most seductive, vain, brilliant, and corrupt labyrinth of all. Prepare yourself, for the heavy veil of resignation and survival has been torn from top to bottom by your own hands, and now you are about to cross the golden, imposing gates of the second evolutionary portal. We leave behind the modesty and the fear of poverty to enter the colossal empire of the inflated ego, of the frantic accumulation of riches, of exaggerated aesthetics, and of material conquest without limit, the burning, intoxicating, and dangerous kingdom of Helen. When the American soul finally breaks free from the suffocating grip of raw survival, it doesn't walk calmly toward the light. It explodes like a firework over a 4th of July skyline. The seed that manages to break through the hard, cold ground of scarcity discovers, with eyes wide and hungry, the vastness of the world of material opportunity, and is instantly possessed by a colossal hunger for compensation. Carl Jung, with the sharp serenity of one who has mapped every desert and abyss of the spirit, observed this pendular phenomenon with immense fascination and deep compassion. He called this second portal the Veil of Helen, a mythical reference to the overwhelming beauty and pride capable of setting entire empires ablaze. In the reality of a culture built on the self-made man myth and the American dream, this is the exact moment when the individual decides they will no longer accept being just a cog in the machine of poverty. They want the top of the world, and they will make sure everyone is a witness to their ascent. The primitive fear of not having enough is replaced by the absolute terror of being invisible, of being a nobody in a society that only worships somebodies. The ego wakes up famished, discovers the seductive power of its own brand, and decides that the entire world must bow before its newfound strength. In this bright and excessive kingdom, vital energy, once focused solely on survival, is directed like a volcanic eruption toward the construction of an unshakable personal empire. Life transforms into a frantic search for the VIP experience, that exclusive gated area of life where only the winners are allowed and where everyone else is watching from behind the velvet rope. It is the culture of the hustle, taken to its most extreme and cruel power. The individual builds castles of arrogance, driving through the neon-lit streets of the city in luxury vehicles that scream their financial worth, wearing designer labels that act as a shield against their old insecurities, and demanding access to the most restricted boardrooms and penthouses. It isn't enough to have financial security anymore. One must exhibit an almost aggressive wealth to generate respect, fear, and envy in those who stayed behind. Jung understood perfectly that the soul, frightened by its own empty immensity and secretly traumatized by ancestral lack, tries to fill its inner abyss by devouring the material world with a voracious urgency. This is the era of unbridled ambition, the volcanic energy that drives CEOs and social media influencers to build meteoric fortunes. But it also carries, planted at its very core, the seed of the most devastating and solitary mental exhaustion. Romantic and social relationships under the blinding, cold light of Helen's veil become dangerous, calculating, and terribly superficial transactions. Love, at this stage of development intoxicated by power, is not a compassionate meeting of two souls, but a mere negotiation of status, aesthetic capital, and influence. A partner is hand-picked and displayed like a trophy, a high-end accessory meant to beautify the winner's image and affirm their dominance in the social arena. In the cold reality of this stage, one loves only the reflection of their own power and vanity, shining in the submissive eyes of the other. When this reflection loses its magic, or when physical beauty inevitably begins to yield to the weight of time, affection turns into cold, calculating disposal, generating a succession of frozen hearts and resentments that accumulate like debt. People become commodities on a ruthless emotional shelf, evaluating and being evaluated solely by the power and aesthetics they can offer the other's ego. The individual, who thinks they are the master of their own destiny, becomes a terrified slave to the maintenance of their own mask of opulence, living under constant paranoia of losing their fortune, their youth, and the fawning attention of the crowd they bought. But what actually happens when the crystal mirror finally shatters, and the image of omnipotence you built with such cunning and ruthlessness bleeds before your own consciousness? Have you ever fought for years, crushing your own empathy to reach the unattainable peak of a corporate ladder, only to discover that the view from the top is one of freezing, terrifying loneliness? Why is it that at the exact moment you finally possess everything money and influence can buy, a dark, ancient melancholy invades your chest, whispering that your soul is still starving to death? The great hidden tragedy of the Helen stage, one that hits the heart of the modern Western achiever, is that matter will never have the power to warm the true coldness of the human spirit. Gold and luxury galas do not feed the soul. They only embalm it luxuriously for its own funeral while still alive. When you deposit the entire meaning of your existence and your false security in things that time, betrayal, or a shift in the market can destroy overnight, you build your marble fortress on a lake of thin ice. Physical beauty, the supreme crown of vanity, withers mercilessly. Bank accounts overflow, mansions are climate-controlled, but the price charged for this plastic life is the total bankruptcy of genuine vital energy. The ego, once drunk on the illusion of being an untouchable god on earth, suddenly discovers itself as a solitary prisoner, walking in circles inside a gilded cage it built and locked from the inside. The promise that infinite accumulation would bring absolute peace reveals itself to be the most cruel and devastating lie of all. It is exactly at this unsustainable point of tension that the empire of appearances begins to crumble silently in the middle of sleepless nights. The individual, even at the height of social prestige, is swallowed by a crisis of meaning so dense and heavy that no one around them, blinded by the glitter of their success, can notice the despair. The facial expression remains impassive in business meetings. The expensive dinners continue, but inside, panic and an acidic boredom corrode the mind's structures. There is a deep existential nausea, a suffocating feeling that this life of excess is a monumental farce, a grotesque theater without a soul. The soul feels tainted, soiled by the decadence and immorality of its own conquests. It realizes with brutal clarity that it traded its peace of mind for shiny, empty trinkets. The excess of freedom without values, the superficiality of passions, and the moral chaos create a self-loathing, a desperate urgency for purification that burns the chest like a cold fire. The human mind, in its instinctive urge to find salvation before losing its sanity, does not retreat in a balanced way. It acts like a lead pendulum swinging into the void. When the emotional pain of Helen's decadence becomes a nauseating burden, the person seeks a cure by running violently to the absolute extreme of repression and order. They want to escape the deafening chaos of empty pleasures and worldly life. They decide, abruptly and radically, that they need a moral structure of iron, an ancient and unquestionable purity, a rigid authority to come and scrub away all the stains left by their material illusions. In an act of deep and punitive regret, the individual convinces themselves that modern influence and desire are the roots of all human rot, and that the body and the ego need to be tamed, punished, and subjected to a system of unbreakable dogmas. How long can a human being endure the crushing weight of a life where every smile is calculated, every relationship is a power game, and there isn't a single second of authentic peace? What remains of your humanity at the exact moment the driver turns off the engine of the car? The silence of the night takes over your isolated estate, and you realize you would trade the entire empire for a single moment of true forgiveness and peace. The desperate flight from this decadent world of vanity does not lead the soul directly to the light of true liberation, but pushes it into a new and heavy psychic fortress. Repulsed by the false brilliance and meaninglessness of the Helen stage, consciousness runs swiftly toward the safe harbor of the most rigorous and severe tradition. It finds refuge in the sacred, but a sacred interpreted through the lenses of fear, punitive authority, and absolute control over oneself and others. The soul leaves the chaotic party of excess, puts on the heavy clothes of absolute righteousness, and marches, with eyes downcast and a grim face, toward the grand and intimidating iron gates of the third veil. A formidable and icy structure rises. It is the dense kingdom where orthodoxy and dogma rule without admitting the slightest hesitation, where blind obedience to an ancient moral code replaces living compassion, and where the world is again divided with a sword between the righteous and the sinners who deserve punishment. We leave behind the excesses of Troy and the feverish ostentation to enter the silent, guarded, and heavy corridors of strict morality. Prepare to meet the internal tribunal where light is used not to warm, but to blind and judge without mercy every unholy thought. The implacable, traditional, and terrifying Temple of Mary, when the neon lights of the Helen stage finally flicker out, leaving you with nothing but a pounding headache and a hollow chest. The human soul doesn't just stop, it recoils. It swings like a massive rusted pendulum away from the chaos of the self-made empire and toward the cold, hard sanctuary of absolute order. This is the moment you decide that the world is too loud, too dirty, and too broken, and you resolve to fix it by fixing yourself, or at least the version of yourself the world sees. Carl Jung, watching this transition with the patient eyes of a man who has seen 1,000 civilizations rise and fall, called this the third portal, the Veil of Mary. In our modern Western world, this isn't just about religion in the traditional sense. It is the stage of the good citizen, the righteous activist, or the perfect professional. It is the moment you trade your leather jacket for a suit, your wild nights for a strict routine, and your raw desires for a list of moral commandments. You build a fortress of virtue around your life, made of picket fences, polished resumes, and an unshakable belief that if you just follow the rules perfectly, the pain will finally stop. The Temple of Mary is beautiful, white and silent, but the air inside is thin, and the light is so blindingly artificial that it leaves no room for anything human to breathe. Have you ever felt that sudden, desperate urge to delete your past, to scrub your social media clean, and to finally get your life together by adhering to a strict new code of conduct? Why is it that the more we try to be perfect and good, the more we find ourselves boiling with a hidden, inexplicable anger toward everyone else? Jung understood that when we enter this stage, we are performing a kind of spiritual surgery on ourselves without anesthesia. We take all our messy parts, our anger, our wild sexuality, our secret greed, and our inconvenient doubts, and we lock them in a soundproof basement we call the unconscious. We put on the mask of the saint, the gatekeeper of morality, and we walk through the world with our chins high, convinced that we are finally clean. But Jung warns us of a terrifying law of the soul. What you repress does not die. It just waits in the dark, growing teeth. He called this the shadow. In our culture, the Veil of Mary manifests as the obsession with cancel culture and the relentless pursuit of the moral high ground. We become the hunters of other people's sins because we cannot bear to look at our own. We join the digital witch hunts, pointing our fingers at the unholy or the problematic, feeling an intoxicating rush of righteousness that masks the fact that we are just as broken as the people we condemn. The Temple of Mary is a place of absolute judgment, where the world is divided into a neat binary map of us and them, the saved and the damned, the virtuous and the monsters. There is a dark, historical irony that Jung often pointed out. The most horrific acts of cruelty in human history weren't usually committed by people who thought they were evil, but by people who were absolutely certain they were doing the right thing. When you are convinced you are a soldier for the light, you can justify any amount of darkness. This is the trap of the Mary stage. You become so obsessed with being a good person that you lose your ability to be a real person. You sacrifice your authenticity on the altar of social approval. You say the right things, wear the right clothes, and support the right causes, but inside, you are dying of thirst. Your relationships become cold and transactional, based on whether the other person fits into your moral framework. You love the idea of people, but you cannot love the reality of them, because reality is messy, and Mary demands perfection. You become a judge instead of a witness, a statue instead of a human being. What happens to the man who spends 40 years building a perfect life, only to realize he has never actually lived a single day of it? Is a life of pure virtue worth living if it requires you to murder the very heart that beats inside you? Can you ever truly be at peace while you are constantly looking over your shoulder, terrified that your own shadow will finally catch up to you? The daily life of someone trapped in the third veil is an exhausting performance of the good life. Every word is measured, every action is weighed against the expectations of the group, and every thought is filtered through a sieve of guilt. You become the architect of your own prison, brick by brick, rule by rule. You look at the people who are still lost in the Helen stage, the ones still chasing money and sex, and you feel a toxic mixture of pity and secret, agonizing envy. You hate them because they are doing the things you've forbidden yourself from doing. Your virtue isn't actually based on love, it's based on the fear of being found out. You are terrified that if you let your guard down for even a second, the monster in the basement will break out and ruin everything you've built. So you double down. You become even more rigid, even more judgmental, and even more certain that you are right. You become a pillar of salt, frozen in a posture of permanent rectitude, unable to move, unable to change, and unable to feel. But the universe has a way of shattering even the strongest fortresses. No one can live as a statue forever. Jung observed that eventually, the tension between the perfect mask and the hidden shadow becomes so great that the psychic rubber band snaps. It usually happens when you least expect it. A sudden, scandalous mistake, a loss that your rules can't explain away, or a midlife crisis that hits like a freight train. Suddenly, the white marble of your temple begins to crack. You realize that all your goodness hasn't actually made you happy. It has only made you tired. You look in the mirror and you don't recognize the person looking back, because that person is a stranger made of expectations and social pressure. The floor beneath your feet, which you thought was solid rock, turns out to be thin ice over a very deep, very dark lake. This is the most terrifying moment of the entire journey. You can't go back to the mindless survival of Eve, and you can't go back to the flashy vanity of Helen, because you've seen through those illusions. But now you can't stay in the rigid safety of Mary either, because you've realized it's a lie. You are standing in the ruins of your own identity, stripped of your pride, your titles, and your moral certainty. For the first time in your life, you are truly, dangerously alone. Jung watches you in this moment with a profound, silent reverence, because he knows that the saint must die so that the human can be born. You are about to fall through the cracks of your own life and into a place where rules don't exist and the light of the sun cannot reach. It is a place of total undoing, a spiritual furnace where every lie you've ever told yourself will be burned away until there is nothing left but the truth. Welcome to the great collapse. Welcome to the end of your perfect world. You are standing on the edge of the abyss, and the only way out is down into the silent, suffocating, and transformative dark night of the soul. When the thick, whitewashed walls of the Temple of Mary finally collapse under the weight of their own hidden hypocrisy and the exhaustion of trying to be perfect, there is no new floor beneath your feet to catch the fall. The grand American parade of getting it right, of being the perfect parent, the impeccable professional, the righteous citizen, comes to a screeching, silent halt. What follows is a terrifying, lonely, and dizzying plunge into a bottomless abyss, a space devoid of light, sound, and every old certainty that once kept you upright. To this narrow and suffocating corridor, the ancient mystics gave the name, the dark night of the soul. Carl Jung, with the reverence of a high priest before the sacred, understood that this monumental collapse of your identity was not a sign of failure, a clinical diagnosis to be medicated away, or a hint of madness. Instead, he saw it as the most crucial, purifying, and unavoidable stage of the entire human journey. It is the great alchemical furnace, the invisible, relentless fire, where the heavy lead of your ego and your social masks must melt completely so that the pure gold of your true consciousness can finally be born. In this dramatic and inevitable moment of transition, you lose everything you used to define yourself to the world. You are no longer the provider struggling to survive, as you were in the veil of Eve. You no longer find any comfort or distraction in the material success, the VIP status, or the fleeting beauty that dictated the frantic rules of the Helen stage. And tragically, you have realized with a bitter clarity that the moral rules and the good person persona of the Mary Veil were just heavy chains disguised as virtue. Who are you then, when all your masks, even the most respected ones, are torn from your face at once? The pain of this revelation is raw and paralyzing. It feels like waking up in the middle of a vast frozen desert, without a map, without a memory, and without a clue which way leads home. In a culture like ours, where we are trained from childhood to fix things, to pivot, and to find a solution to every problem through hard work and a can-do attitude, the dark night of the soul hits with a devastating force. Because in this inner abyss, the American hustle simply does not work. You cannot buy your way out of this silence. You cannot use your professional network to skip the line of spiritual maturation, and you cannot distract yourself with a vacation when the void is inside the suitcase. Life presents the bill, and it demands payment in full, in the currency of your own truth. Many people, upon reaching this phase of total deconstruction, face inexplicable and painful events in the outside world, as if reality were a mirror of their internal ruin. It seems as if the universe is conspiring to strip away everything that offered a false sense of security. A high-flying career is suddenly ended by a layoff. A marriage that looked perfect in the Christmas cards ends in a cold divorce. Or a sudden health crisis forces the body that never knew how to rest to stay motionless in a dark room. An overwhelming existential fatigue, a tiredness that sleep cannot touch, takes over every muscle. For a people who value results above all else, the heavens suddenly seem blind and deaf to your most desperate prayers. The old pleasures of the American dream lose their flavor entirely, and the old ambitions of conquest seem like the loud, exhausting games of a child who has stayed up too late. It is a moment of extreme tension and a quiet, heavy danger, where despair tries to convince the weakened mind that this is the definitive end, that there is no way out, and that all the effort of your life was a cruel mistake. Terrified by the intensity of this purifying fire, vast numbers of people retreat in total panic. They try desperately to run backward, fleeing from their own healing. They seek to numb the ache by returning to old vices, burying themselves in mindless work, or buying things they don't need to fill a hole that isn't material. Some cling with a violent, desperate grip to new dogmas, political extremes, or cult-like groups, begging for any lie that will protect them from the deafening silence of their own naked soul. But Jung, reaching out his steady hand through the darkness of history, begs us to have the audacity to remain still. He teaches us that the fire of this alchemical furnace does not have the power to burn your true essence. It consumes only what is false, fragile, and borrowed in you. Everything that hurts, bleeds, and screams in this stage is not your immortal spirit. It is your vain and proud ego twitching as it dies. The dark night is not a punishment, it is a spiritual surgery. Life, in its infinite and ruthless wisdom, is removing everything that prevents you from being truly free. For the new life to inhabit you, the old house of cards must be burned to the ground. Imagine the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a dark room where the walls are slowly closing in. Your first reaction is to scream, to fight, to blame the economy, your parents, the system, or your partner. But the invisible law of this portal dictates that the more you fight the furnace, the more the fire burns your skin. The great turning point of this journey, the secret whispered by the old alchemists, is that your salvation is not found in winning the fight against the dark, but in surrendering to it. It is the terrifying and beautiful moment of total let go. You stop trying to be the strong one. You stop trying to be the good one or the successful one. You collapse on the floor of your own life, and you finally accept your own weakness, your own smallness, and your own monstrous shadow. And in that humble instant of surrender, the miracle happens. When you stop fighting yourself, when you look at your flaws without judgment, the fire suddenly stops burning. It stops because there is no more fake you left to consume. The heavy lead of the ego has finally melted. What rises from the ashes of this night is not a warrior or a saint, but a real human being, authentic, stripped of arrogance, and bathed in a peace that no storm can ever disturb again. The world out there will still be chaotic, but it no longer has the power to destroy your inner sanctuary. The void in your heart is no longer a scary pit. It is a clean vessel, ready for the golden light of wisdom. The long, exhausting race is over. When the thick smoke of the great dark night finally clears, and the last embers of the alchemical furnace cool, what remains is not the terrifying void your mind once feared, but an incredibly clear, light, and silent vastness. The dawn that follows the collapse of our proud ego is soft, radiant, and carries a serenity that transcends any common human understanding. Carl Jung, contemplating the peak of spiritual evolution, gave this final and majestic portal the sacred name of Sophia, the universal personification of wisdom. To pass through the veil of Sophia does not mean to acquire all the intellectual knowledge of books. or to transform into an untouchable mystical being floating above the harsh material reality of American life. On the contrary, for us, living in a culture of high-speed performance, constant noise, and the pressure of the next big thing, true wisdom is the most authentic and liberating return to our own humanity. It is the true lightness of spirit, the ability to walk through the world without losing your own rhythm, even when the world around you seems chaotic. It is that glorious and quiet moment when the internal civil war we have fought our entire lives finally comes to an end. At this supreme level of consciousness, the opposites that once tore your heart apart make an absolute peace. You understand with crystal clarity that light and shadow are not mortal enemies, but complementary forces that sustain the balance of the universe. You stop fighting your own shadow, and by accepting it with compassion, you strip it of all the destructive power it once held over your choices. The peace that blossoms in the Sophia stage is indescribable because it does not depend on anything happening outside your own skin. The economy may remain unstable, the streets of our cities may remain loud and cold, and the people around you may continue to drown in their own illusions and ego battles. But your inner sanctuary remains unshakable, like the bottom of a deep ocean that does not stir during the storms on the surface. The great transformation that occurs at this level of integration is not something magical or distant. It is deeply practical, grounded, and visible in how you begin to relate to existence. Remember the invisible chains that imprisoned the soul in previous stages. In the Eve stage, the dread of poverty and the constant anxiety of the next paycheck controlled every step and every drop of sweat in the struggle for survival. In the world of Helen, the desperate need for approval, for displaying success on social media, and for having the right brand dictated the exhausting rules of the game. In the icy corridors of Mary's temple, the ruthless judgment, the pose of the perfect citizen, and the crushing sense of guilt suppressed any attempts at authentic freedom. But the one who finally settles in the Garden of Sophia looks at all these old prisons and illusions with a gentle, nostalgic, and understanding smile. When you reach the total integration drawn by the old sage, you completely lose the exhausting desire to judge the path of others. If you see an acquaintance obsessed with money and keeping up with the Joneses, buying things they can't afford to impress people they don't like, you don't feel anger, contempt, or envy. You feel a deep compassion, for you recognize in them the exact same spiritual hunger and the same void that once tormented you. If you enter a debate or sit at a family Thanksgiving table and meet someone pointing the finger with hate, condemning others' mistakes and flaunting their own supposed virtue, you don't take the bait of conflict. You see the unbearable pain of emotional suppression that holds that person captive. Divine wisdom teaches that no one acts with cruelty, vanity, or prejudice out of pure malice, but out of extreme ignorance and a terrifying disconnect from their own soul. The sage forgives the world around them because they have already forgiven themselves for the same mistakes made during their long journey through the dark. But how can we turn this ancient and profound concept into a living, pulsing, and practical reality in our daily, often frantic American lives? Applying this wisdom requires a loving but constant vigilance. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rises, your responsibilities will still be there. The monthly bills will keep coming, and the people on the streets will still be rushed and impatient. The secret of Sophia is not to run away from daily life, to quit society and go live as a hermit in the mountains, but to live fully in the material world without being its slave. The practice of true wisdom begins the very moment a problem arises that tests your peace. When someone rudely cuts you off in traffic or insults you at work, instead of reacting with the aggressive instinct of Eve or the wounded pride of Helen, take a deep breath and create a sacred space of silence between the other's insult and your reaction. Observe the emotion boiling in your chest, but do not let it take the steering wheel of your life. When the temptation to compare yourself with the unreal, edited, and filtered success of social media knocks on your door in a moment of weakness, recognize the seductive voice of your former vanity. Thank it for reminding you to have ambition, but politely decline the invitation to once again become an anxious prisoner of social masks. True human integration, as Jung taught, is the rare ability to use all the tools of the physical world without allowing any of them to rule over you. You can and should seek financial comfort. You can enjoy travel, take care of your health and aesthetics, and follow firm ethical principles. But you now do all this with an incredibly light heart, knowing in your soul that none of these fleeting things define your true value or the immortal greatness of your essence. It is crucial to understand, so as not to fall into the subtle trap of a new illusion of perfection, that the journey of human development is not a straight upward line ending in a final diploma. It is a continuous, organic, and challenging spiral. We are painfully and wonderfully human, and there will be dark days when strong pain, an unexpected crisis, a loss in the family, or simply extreme tiredness will cause you to slip and fall back into old patterns of behavior. You might wake up bathed in the peace of Sophia, but react out of fear of lack during a financial dispute, or show the ruthless rigidity of Mary in a moment of acute stress. When this happens, and it inevitably will happen over the years, do not despair and never condemn yourself. The great and final victory does not consist in being a flawless avatar who never again falls into the traps of the labyrinth, but in having the immediate awareness to recognize where you are and to find the exact, loving path back to your center. Jung left us the most precious and profound map the exploration of consciousness has ever known, but the act of walking on your own feet requires your daily courage. The very fact that you have reached this point in the narrative, listened to every one of these words, and had the immense bravery to look into your own darkness without running away, proves irrefutably that your soul is already mature, tired of senseless suffering, and ready for true existential liberation. You are no longer a blind, sleeping passenger on the crowded train of existence. Your eyes are now wide open to reality, and the shining keys to all your internal prisons are resting serenely in your own hands. The invitation to a full life has been made, and the golden door of final understanding is completely unlocked, waiting only for you to take the next step with confidence, lightness, and compassion. I sincerely hope, from the bottom of my heart, that this deep and intense journey through the four portals of the human mind has illuminated the most forgotten corners of your interior and will bring an unshakable and lasting peace to your future days. But knowledge only gains true life and turns into transformative wisdom when it is shared and recognized in community. Therefore, I ask you to leave a real mark of your brave passage through this journey. Subscribe to this channel right now to ensure that we will continue to walk and evolve together in the next explorations of the mysteries of the human spirit. Like this video, as this small and quick gesture greatly helps to spread this essential light to thousands of other people who are still wandering, suffering in silence in their own voiceless labyrinths and not knowing how to get out. And most importantly of all, go down to the comments section below and write what you felt in your heart throughout this journey. Honestly, tell us which of these veils, Eve, Helen, Mary, or Sophia, you recognized your own life and your pains in at this very moment in your story. Do not be afraid to be vulnerable in front of others, for vulnerability is the mark of the strong. If you prefer to protect your private life and your intimate story, change your profile name and comment anonymously. But please, do not deprive yourself of the opportunity to express your discovery outwardly. Naming your truth out loud is the first and most important step toward the final healing of our suffering. Your story, however simple it may seem to you, may be exactly the key that was missing to inspire and free the person who reads your comment next. May eternal wisdom guide your steps on the streets of this world today and always, and may you finally find that welcoming and unshakable peace that has always lived inside you, just waiting for its awakening. A big, warm hug, and until our next deep encounter,